Next up, I want to talk about animations. And animations are ultimately quite simple. You basically always play images in a sequence. The issue with that is that there are two ways to store all of these images. You can either have separate images, or you can have what is called a sprite sheet. For this project, we are going to work with both. So let's have a quick look at what we have inside of our graphics folder. If you look on the left, there we have graphics, and in there we have all of the folders. If you look inside of lights, there we have a fan animation. And these are just individual images that we want to play in sequence. So we just have about 48 different images. It goes from 0 to 47. Alternatively, what we also have, if I minimize the lights and look at explosions, there we have just 3 images. And if I look at one of these images in a bit more detail, you can see that we have one images with lots of individual images on top of it. Essentially what we want to do is to pick individual parts from that. So this is another thing we have to figure out. And this sprite I don't want to have in the scene. But the main thing you have to understand is that we have to pick individual parts of these images. Like anything else in Godot, what we have to use are different nodes. Godot can cover both, but you are using different nodes for each. If you have separate images, you would use an animated sprite 2D. It works kind of like a sprite, so the node we have already seen, except it wants multiple textures instead of a single one. If you have a sprite sheet, you would use the normal sprite 2D, because that one has an animation tab, which allows you to pick specific parts of a larger image. Back in Godot, first of all, I want to close the Steam vent, the simple light, and the wall light. We don't need those anymore. Instead, I want to create a new scene. And for this new scene, we have another root node. And this root node is going to be an animated sprite 2D. If I double click on that, we get an animated sprite 2D along with a warning. The warning being that we are going to need sprite frames as a resource. I'm going to cover that in a second. First of all though, I want to rename this and let's call it light fan animation. To work with this kind of animated sprite, you want to look on the right under animations, because there we have sprite frames. And right now it's empty, which is what Godot really does not like. To fix that, we have to click on it and then new sprite frames. If you have that, nothing changes. But if you click on it again, now we get another kind of editor. In here, on the left side, we can set a couple of animations. Right now, we only have default, and this is what I want to keep. You could rename it though if you double click on it. But on top of that, you could also add new ones with this icon. So if you want to have multiple animations, this is how you would use that. Although in my case, I want to delete these new animations because we don't need any of that. Instead, I want to look at lights, and in there we have the fan animation. And this contains all of the images. And all of these images I want to drag into these animation frames. And there you can see we have lots of textures. Once you have that, you can click on this play icon, and then we are getting an animation. Right now it's looking really choppy because we only have 5 frames per second. If I change this to 24, then we have a much smoother animation. And well, this is kind of all you have to know about the basics of animated sprites. They basically work like sprites, but instead of one texture, you are working with sprite frames where you have multiple textures. That's pretty much it. And with that, I can save all of that. Let's say under scenes, I want to save this. I guess objects also work, although this folder is getting quite crowded, but it works for this one. And now that we have that, I want to look at the level, and now we can add inside of the ground node 2D, the light fan animation. And this we can move around, and there we get the same issue again that we have seen in the last part, that right now I want to grab the light fan animation, but we have lots of stuff on top, which makes all of this a bit annoying to work with. So because of that, I want to lock projectiles and I want to lock the gate. With that, I should be able to drag the fan animation, and there we go. This is feeling better. And let's just say I want to have it somewhere in here. And don't forget to enable it so it plays. And then I can run the game and move towards this area. And there we should have, well, we don't have an animation, but at the very least we have an image. The reason why that didn't work is because we have to click on this icon, which says autoplay on load. And now I can run all of this. And if I get to the area, we now have the animation. So this is what we actually wanted. And well, with that, we have pretty much all we need for this kind of node. On top of that, you could also grab this node and transform it. For example, we could change the scale and double it in size. If I save it now, we get a much larger one. Let me move it a bit further to the middle, and there. I think this is looking okay. Now, this light fan animation, you can also target in code quite easily, and we actually haven't written code in a while, and for this one, we still don't need it. But once again, the main thing you want to do in there is you could update the animation. In our case, we don't need it because we only have a single one. If you want to update the animation, you would simply the animation property. Cool, but this is the first kind of animation that you could be working with. It's super easy. I guess while we are here, we could also add another smaller thing. And that is, with the light fan selected, I want to add a point light 2D. For this one, once again, I want to look at the lights. There we have textures, and then drag circle.png. Not what I meant to do. I want to drag circle.png into the texture. And now we can make all of this quite a bit brighter. Let me change the texture scale and the energy. And now if I save this, we get even more light inside of this area. This might be a bit too much, so a lot less energy. Now let's save it. And there we get another kind of effect. Importantly for this one, you do not want to have shadows. With that, we have the first kind of animation along with a bit of light. Next up, I want to add the explosions. And this I want to do inside of the grenades. So basically right now, we only have grenades that work like hockey pucks. They just move, but they don't explode. Let's work on that a bit more. Which means with Control or Command Shift and O, I want to open the grenade. And here you can see we have a grenade, we have a sprite 2D, and a collision shape. So basically nothing is happening. To work on that a bit more, I want to add the animation, and this is in a sprite sheet. Let me, before I add the node, look at this. So instead of explosions, we have, let's say, explosion 2, and zoom out. We have one image that contains a huge amount of smaller images. And basically what we want to do is to pick individual parts from that and then play them in sequence. For that, we can use a normal sprite 2D, the node we have already used many, many times. Because in there, in the inspector, we have animations. This one has a few properties. We have H frames, V frames, and then frame. If I increase the number, you can see quite well what this is doing. If I change this to 2, we are cutting the entire thing in half. And if I increase the number even further, at some point, we are down to 1 column. And let me draw on this, that should be easier to explain. When you look at this image, you notice that we basically have columns like so, and then we have rows like so. In total, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 columns. And I think the same amount of rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 indeed. What H frames and V frames want is the amount of columns and rows that we have. H frames covers the columns and V frames covers the rows. Which means in our case, we have 8 columns and 8 rows. And you can already see, I can zoom in now, and we can't see anything. Because the very first frame doesn't have any kind of image. And I should show my mouse. You can see it. Right now, we are splitting up the image into 8 columns and 8 rows. And currently, we have the first item selected, which doesn't have anything, so we can't see anything at all right now. But if I increase this number, at some point, we get an image, and the higher the frame number is, the further we get in the animation. And I can click on this faster, and then we cycle through the animation. That's literally all that's happening in here. So if you cycle around, you have the animation. You can even be a bit more specific, because under there we have another attribute called frame coordinates. There you can target the column and the row more specifically. For example, if I set the frame back to 0, we get X and Y being 0. But if I change this frame to, let's say, 2, then we move X to 2, but we stay on the first row. I hope the system makes sense. If you play around with it, it should be fairly straightforward. Now though, we have another issue, and that is none of this plays automatically in the game. So this kind of behavior we have to program, and that would be kind of an issue. Now we could manually target every single frame inside of code and then make this work, but that would be really annoying to work with, so we need a better solution. And fortunately, Godot has another better solution, which is actually one of the most important nodes you can learn about. That node is the animation player. And basically what it does is it plays an animation. Doesn't sound like a lot, but the reason why this is powerful is because when we talk animation in this context, we mean literally any kind of change in property. It could be a movement, a rotation, animation frames, light energy, or literally any property of any node. You can also use an animation player to call methods on a certain node, and you get a huge amount of control over how these things change. So let's play around with that. First of all though, I want to clean things up a bit, and for that I'm going to get rid of explosion 2. So let me delete it, and instead, with grenade selected, I'm going to add a simple sprite 2D. And this sprite 2D is going to get explosion 3. This is the one I actually want to use. So I'm dragging it into the texture. Now we get another kind of sprite frame. And on that, once again, I have 8 columns and 8 rows. Which means now we can animate via the frame what kind of image we actually want. And by default, let me set it to 0. Also, I want to rename the sprite 2D to explosion. That feels significantly cleaner. Cool. With that, I have the grenade selected, and now I want to add an animation player. If you just type in animation, you get animation player and animation tree. For this tutorial, we are only going to use the animation player. However, if you use more complex games, especially 3D ones, you want to use an animation tree to control the animation you have inside of the animation player. Although for now, don't worry too much about that. I simply want to add an animation player, and then we are good to go. At the bottom, we have another kind of editor that doesn't really have any kind of content. To change that, you have to click on animation. This gives you another menu, and in there, you can click on new. This is going to create a new animation. The kind of animation I want to create, I want to call explosion. Once you have that, you get a timeline. Right now, we have a timeline. You can drag a kind of indicator around, and this timeline goes from 0 to 1 second. Although you can make it longer, so on the right, you can set this to 1 second, or 2 seconds, or 10 seconds, whatever you fancy. In my case, I want to set the animation length to 2 seconds. For these kind of values, you just want to choose whatever looks best in the end. There's no universal value. You can also change the units, there's seconds or frames per second. The indicator, right now, we are moving in increments of 0.1 seconds. And quite a few more, but none of this really matters. What instead is incredibly important is this add track. If you click on that, you get a menu of what kind of value you want to animate. In our case, we want to animate a property track. So if I click on that, then Godot is asking me to select a node. And in my case, I want to select the explosion. Or more specifically, the sprite 2D that is called explosion. If I now click on OK, Godot is asking me which kind of property of this node I want to animate. In my case, I want to target the frame of the sprite 2D. And on this, I can click open. And now we have the frame property. And if I look back at the sprite 2D explosion, all the way on the right, we now have keys. This is because of this property that we have set. Or more specifically, because we connected this sprite to an animation player. And now with that, we can create keyframes. So right now in the timeline, I am at second 0. And if I click on the key next to frame, I have added a keyframe for this time, which means at this time, we are going to have this frame. However, if I now go to 1 second, I can right click on it and insert another key, or to be more specific, another keyframe. And if I click on this one on the right in the inspector, we get another value. So for example, in there, I could set this to 1. And now if I go further to the right, I can right click again, insert another keyframe, click on this one, and then increase the value by 1 again. And now if I move along the timeline, and let me zoom in a bit. If I now play all of this, we get a very basic animation. And if I move these keys closer to each other, you can see a bit better what's going on. So if I now play it, we get a really slow animation. It doesn't look particularly good, but that is a rather small issue. All we need are more images, and then we have all we need. Let me get rid of all of these keyframes and move the timeline back to 0. Now, with the explosion sprite selected, I want to get my start frame. For this particular one, I want to start with frame 29. So let me increase this a bit. And I want to start on 29. Actually, 28 might be better. Let's start with this one. So 27, this is where I want to start. If I now click on the key, we have added 1 keyframe, and we have moved the timeline forward by 1 increment, so 0.1 second. Because of that, still with the explosion selected, I can click on this key multiple times. And every time we get the next frame inside of this animation, and we're moving the timeline forward a tiny bit. So I can do this multiple times, and I want to go up to frame 44. Or we can go a tiny bit further. I guess this one looks good. You do want to be careful here, because if you keep on moving forward, at some point you reach the end of the timeline. And then you would get some weird behavior. So in my case, I want to extend all of this, let's say 2.4 seconds. And if I now play all of this, we are getting an animation. So this is working really good. And this is the basics of what you can do with animations. Pretty much all you want to do is always add another track, then you have a property track, and then you select a node. And on that, for example, I could get the grenade. Now you can update one property of this node, and literally any property of this node can be animated. There's no limit to it. Also, what you can do inside of the animation player, we still have autoplay on load, and we have looping the animation. So both of these you could use just fine, like we have seen for the other animation. Let's say I want to autoplay this animation. If I now run the game, I shoot a grenade, there we get an animation. Although you can see this isn't ideal yet. We keep the last frame of the animation, so we still have to work a bit more on this. I want to select the animation player again, and if you click on the node and you don't get the editor, all you have to do is click on the animation at the bottom, and there we are again. I want to add another track, but now I want to call a method. And the method is going to be onGrenade. And now we get another timeline. If I now right-click on this, I can insert a key, and now Godot is asking me what method I want to call. Right now, grenade doesn't have any custom functions, so we can only call the inbuilt ones. But that is all we need for now. The one I want to call is called Q3. This destroys a node. So this is the method I want to call at the end of this animation. And now, if I run all of this again, I can shoot a grenade, and by the end, it disappears. Because we literally destroy the node. I can actually demonstrate. If I go to remote and look at the projectiles, I can still shoot a laser, and we get a laser inside of the projectiles. And if I shoot a grenade, we get a grenade for a bit, but after a while, the grenade disappears again, along with the animation. So this is exactly what we wanted. And once again, All we need to do for all of this is an animation player. And this could do even more. There's a lot of stuff you can do in here. As a matter of fact, we can do an exercise with this one. I want you guys to add a red light to the grenade. On top of that, add another animation to the animation player and use that to make the red light blink for 2 seconds. The energy property of the light is probably what you want to use for that, but just play around. On top of that, add another function to the root node of the grenade. This function should be called explode. And at the end of the animation for the blinking, I want you guys to call this function. Pause the video and try to implement this one yourself. First of all, I want to create another animation. So with animation, I click on new, and let's call this one blinking. Inside of this animation, we have a timeline, and we want to add a track. Although to animate a property, we first of all need the light for the grenade. And for that, with the grenade selected, I want to add another point light 2D. And let me hide the explosion for now, because this one would be distracting. Basically what I want to do is to have a light over this red circle. Also, the collision shape should probably be below the sprite, so we can see a bit better what's going on. Once again, inside of graphics, we have lights and the texture. There we have circle.png. This I want to use for the texture, and I definitely want to scale this down quite a bit. Let's say 0.3, probably too large, 0.2, still quite large. Okay, this one is definitely much too large. 0.01 is too small. 0.1, okay. 0.03 was the ideal number here. On top of that, I want to update the color. So the color for this one should be a reddish tone. And let's go all the way to red. And finally, to make sure the energy works, so we can add some blinking via the energy. This is looking quite good. Which means we can use the animation player to update this energy property. Although, first of all, the animation needs to be 2 seconds long, which means in the timeline, I want to set this to 2 seconds. Now I want to go all the way to the beginning, and at this point, I want to add a track, then a property track. I want to get the point light, and on there, I want to get the energy. If I open this one now, I can either add a keyframe with a right click and insert key, and let's say by default, this should be a 0, so we have no light at all. And let's say if we go to half a second, I could go to point light 2D, and I could add another key via the inspector. Both is totally fine, you get the same result. Although right now, both of these points have a value of 0, so there's no change. Instead, I want to increase the value quite a bit. Let's say this one. And to have a bit clearer numbers, let's go with 10. And if I now click on the key, we go from 0 to 10, which means if I play this, we get an animation. Cool. And now we can go to 1 second, set this to 0 once again, click on the key again, then we get kind of a blinking animation, then 1.5, this should be 10 again, and then I can go to 2 and set this back to 0. If I now play all of this, we get an animation. Although it's not exactly a perfect animation, we probably want to have some slightly faster blinking. For that, I want to move the nodes a bit closer to each other. And once again, I keep on repeating myself, but the more time you spend on all of this, the better it's going to look. And let me move them in equal increments. And what you can also do, if I go to the right part, you can simply duplicate a key. So if I click on duplicate key, we get the same kind of outcome. Now I want to get this one, and let's say for the last one, I want to increase the time to 2.1 second. And now for the final key, I want to duplicate this one. And now we have faster blinking. I guess this one works. And this animation is what we want to play by default on auto load. So now if I run all of this again and shoot the grenade, we get a blinking behavior that stops after 2 seconds. So this is perfect. On top of that, with the animation player selected, I want to call a function at the end of this animation. Now for that, I have to get to my grenade or the script on my grenade, and right now there's literally nothing. So I want to add a function that I called explode. It doesn't need any arguments, and in there for now, I simply want to print explosion. Really important now, make sure you are saving this script. Otherwise, the next step is not going to work. The next step being, I want to add track, then call the method. I want to call the method on the grenade. Now we get another timeline, and Godot wants a function. All the way at the end of the animation, I want to insert a key, and now we have from script methods explode. This is the function I want to call. And if you didn't save the script, you wouldn't have this final step. You wouldn't get this explode function. This is only available once you save the script. But with that, if I run all of this and I shoot a grenade, after 2 seconds, we should get explosion. Cool, this is working. Although in this case, I don't want to print explosion. Instead, what I want to do inside of the animation player, I want to play the explosion animation. And that we can do quite easily. All we have to do is, first of all, we have to get the animation player and then the play method. Already doing that, Godot is giving us a couple of choices. Blinking is the current animation, and instead we want to play explosion. And now, if I run all of this, I can shoot a grenade, it blinks, and then it simply disappears. The reason why this doesn't work is because I have hidden the explosion node. So if I make this one visible, then it should be working. So now if I run all of this again, that is feeling much better. I guess we could refine this a tiny bit though, because this animation doesn't look amazing yet. Inside of explosion. And let me show the editor. There we have the explosion. First of all, I want to hide the actual sprite 2D. So if I hide this, sprite 2D right now is the grenade itself. I want to hide this around this part of the animation because there it's not visible at all. So another property track, I want to get property track, then I want to get sprite 2D, and the value I want to look for is visible. In there, I want to insert a key at this point, and you can already see right now it's enabled, but this should be disabled at this point. And at the beginning, when we start the animation, I want to have another key, and there it should be enabled. Which means now, if we run all of this, at some point, this sprite 2D will not be visible anymore. And this we can use around this timeline to add another track, a property track. I want to get the explosion, and on that, I want to get modulate. What this allows us to do is set the transparency of this animation. And it was up here. If I now insert a key, we get pure white. And this is totally fine. We can leave this as it is. However, if I go all the way to the end of the animation, I can add another key. And this one is going to be fully transparent. And now we are getting the explosion slowly disappearing. So if I now play all of this, the transition is a bit cleaner. On top of that, what you can also do is change how these two values change from one point to another point. And this you do on the right. There you have continuous, discrete, or capture, or you have nearest, linear, or cubic. This is how the animations change. For this one, for example, if we go with cubic, then we get some slightly different behavior. Although in this particular case, it's not too visible, but you can play around with this a lot and get the exact kind of animation that you want. But with that, I can run all of this again, shoot a grenade, and there we have a bit of an issue. So you can see we still have the light. And that is because the sprite 2D was hidden because of the animation. If I now run all of this again with the sprite 2D visible, now this looks better, and let's try an animation. This is looking pretty good. We probably want to hide the light as well. This could be a problem. Yeah, definitely. The light is going to be an issue. So once again, with the animation player, for the explosion, we have to add another track, which is a property track for the point light 2D. And all I really want to do is to hide the light entirely. So this is not hide, this is visible. At the start of the animation, I want to have the light visible, so insert key, it should be visible, and along with the sprite 2D, I want to hide the key. So on this keyframe, I want to make the light disappear. And now this should look better. And there we have another minor issue, but the light disappears. So basically, every time we are playing the animation, we are hiding the sprite 2D. That is because inside of this animation, whenever we are playing this, at the end of the animation, sprite 2D is invisible. I suppose the most secure way to ensure that this isn't going to be a problem, inside of blinking, all the way at the beginning, I want to add a track, a property track, then sprite 2D, and set visible to being enabled all the way at the beginning. And that way, we are not going to have the issue. I can now shoot it, and we have another issue. Now the light isn't being visible anymore. And this, once again, is because inside of explosion, we're hiding the sprite 2D and the point light 2D. So both of these, if we're playing the animation past this point, they are being hidden. So you can see it in the editor right now. This can be an issue. And once again, inside of blinking, all the way at the beginning, one more track, a property track, point light 2D. I want to set this to visible. And now I want to add another value to point light 2D in the beginning. This should be visible. And finally, let's try all of this. If I now shoot it, we get the light, we get the grenade, we get the explosion, and we get a transparency effect. Cool. With that, we have animations. And yeah, I'm happy with this. So this was the animation player, one of the most powerful nodes in all of Godot. And you can have a lot more animations in there, and you can do a lot of things. Also, when you look at add track, there's a lot more stuff that you could work with. I have only touched the surface of this node.